You're watching PM Agenda today. Infrastructure Australia, an independent body that advises government on the sort of infrastructure projects we should be funding, released a 15-year report. It's a plan, if you like, a roadmap, blueprint of the sort of projects, well, the actual projects that should be funded by state and territory governments and the Commonwealth as well. There are 93 priority projects listed here. I'm not going to go through them all for you right now, but other recommendations as well, and this one has been an interesting one and not a new one, that we should shift to more user pays road charging. Instead of paying for our roads through higher car rego costs and also fuel excise, we should actually pay for what we use. Now, that is a process that is on track to happen in the heavy vehicle industry. So trucks, for example, using satellite technology, look at what they actually use and direct the money there. Could we move to that sort of model with passenger cars as well? As I say, it's not a new idea, but again, now has the backing of Infrastructure Australia and is being considered by the federal government. I spoke a little earlier to the Minister for Major Projects, Paul Fletcher. Paul Fletcher, thank you very much for your time. The whole point of Infrastructure Australia was to have an independent body come up with recommendations of infrastructure the country really needs, rather than politicians who for too many years have used projects, bridges, roads and whatnot to pork barrel. So what's the status, can you tell me, of the 93 projects that Infrastructure Australia has now said are a priority? Are they a priority for the government as well?
Well, you're right, David, that what Infrastructure Australia has done today is released a 15-year plan which includes as one component the infrastructure priority list, which is a list of 93 projects around the country based upon consultation with state and territory governments and other stakeholders. So these are at various stages of progress. In most cases, they need to progress to a business case stage before they could go to Infrastructure Australia for a recommendation to the Commonwealth Government as to whether the project is worthy of funding. Of course, state and territory governments are also providers of funding as well. But what this exercise is about is drawing together in one place a list developed by the national body responsible for infrastructure planning, namely Infrastructure Australia, a list of potential projects. Now, it's a 15-year plan. Some of these projects are ones that would make sense, assuming the business case proves up over the next 5 years. Others of them will be in the 10 to 15-year time frame, but it's a comprehensive
Sure, but as far as the Commonwealth is concerned, these are all now priorities for the federal government, as far as the federal government's concerned?
Well, what needs to happen in respect of any project where Commonwealth funding is being sought is that it needs to come to Infrastructure Australia for an assessment. Now, what I've said today, what the Prime Minister has said today, is that if a project is on this list, it will certainly be a factor for the Commonwealth that will inform us as we consider the forward list of projects that we
But just a factor, I mean, what else would you take into consideration? Obviously you want to make sure the business case stacks up, but surely if independent, this independent body, Infrastructure Australia, is saying, you should do this for the national good, here's the benefit the nation gets, that's got to be a pretty big factor.
Look, it's certainly, if a project is on this list, what it means is that it's overcome or passed, you might say, the first hurdle towards the project proceeding and receiving funding. But there's a number of other hurdles, including a business case, a cost-benefit analysis, and I make the point that there are a wide range of sources of funding. The Commonwealth Government is not the only source of funding for infrastructure projects. Some of these projects, for example, are potentially at least toll roads, expressways, which could be funded out of that revenue stream from the tolling. Other projects will end up being funded wholly or partly by state or territory governments. But certainly I do expect that on this list there will be many projects that will come forward with the project proponents seeking funding from the Commonwealth Government, and we will look at them through that process of Infrastructure Australia to determine whether the business case stacks up, whether the cost-benefit analysis makes sense. So this list is a working tool designed to help Commonwealth government and state make decisions.
Let me go to one of the projects that it says is a top priority, the East-West Link in Melbourne. Now, it's been a controversial issue in Victoria, obviously. As far as the federal government's concerned, Tony Abbott was adamant the $1.5 billion federal commitment could only be used for that East-West Link. The Turnbull government seems to have opened that lockbox and said, well, you can use that money for other projects. Infrastructure Australia says this is a top priority. So what's the position now?
Well, the first thing is the Turnbull government has consistently said that if a Victorian government chose to proceed with East-West Link, we would support it. I mean, bear in mind, this is a project that was recommended by the Eddington study in 2006 under the Bracks government. There were contracts entered into with construction partners to build the road, and the Andrews government came to power and chose to tear up those contracts, and the Victorian Auditor
But now
General
you're saying, aren't you, that they can use that money for other projects?
And so there's a separate process of engagement with the Victorian government in relation to that money. Treasurer Morrison is taking the lead on that in discussions with Treasurer Pallas. What is clear is that that is Commonwealth government money, and any project it was used on is one that would need to meet the normal standards that we apply in determining which projects to support.
All right, but you're no longer demanding it be spent on the East-West Link, even though Infrastructure Australia clearly thinks it's a top priority.
The East-West Link is a priority for the reasons that Infrastructure Australia has stated, and the Turnbull government has consistently said if a Victorian government chose to proceed with East-West Link, we would support it.
All right, let me ask you about another project in Sydney. The Badgerys Creek rail link, as far as I can see, doesn't appear on the priority list for Infrastructure Australia. Why is that, and what's your current view on any federal funding of the rail link to the new airport?
David, that's principally a function of timing. What we announced late last year was a joint study between the New South Wales government and the Commonwealth government to look at the rail needs of Western Sydney and Western Sydney Airport. So that's to look at what the right route would be, how much it would cost, how should it be funded. Now, Western Sydney Airport is scheduled to open in 2025. Initially, it will be supported by excellent road connections under the $3.6 billion Western Sydney Infrastructure Plan. That's a new expressway, upgrades to the Bringelly Road, Northern Road and so on. So there'll be excellent ground transport. Over time,
but will there be enough passengers willing to drive out there and park there or whatever? I mean, surely you would accept that a rail link's going to be pretty important for the viability of Badgerys Creek Airport.
That's the very question this study is looking at, and over time there will be an appropriate point at which to build a rail connection. It's a very substantial expenditure. We certainly believe that when the airport opens, there will be excellent ground transport connections using the road infrastructure that we are funding. $3.6 billion Western Sydney Infrastructure Plan, with $3.2 billion coming from the Commonwealth Government, and that will meet the needs of the airport and users of the airport when it opens, but certainly we're looking at the question of when will the right time be to build a rail connection. Of course, another key point is that that rail connection needs to meet the needs of not just the airport, but of homes and businesses that we expect to be stimulated to grow in the area around the airport. Western Sydney is expected to grow by 1 million people over the next 20 years, and so certainly there is a much broader question about rail serving those areas, including
it needs a lot of infrastructure. Let me just turn, sorry, the time we got left to, just the other recommendation here from Infrastructure Australia. It's not a new one. We've had the Henry Tax Review, the Harper Competition Review, all talk about this. The idea of user pays road charging instead of fuel excise and high rego costs being used to fund our roads. You actually pay for what you use and perhaps tracked on satellite technology as to what you actually use and where the money should go. What do you think? Is it a good idea?
Well, the logic behind it is, first of all, that you would create a funding stream to replace the funding for roads that today comes from fuel excise, that comes from state motor vehicle registration charges and other sources. And in addition, you would move the provision of roads to be a market in which roads are provided as a service to customers who pay for that, as we see in telecommunications or energy, to other infrastructure sectors which have seen a similar transformation over the last 20 to 30 years. But there's a lot of issues to work through. For example, what are the equity implications? Who would win, who would lose out of this? So the specific recommendation...
Would those in country areas lose?
Well, that's a question to be determined, but if you think about telecommunications, it's difficult to provide telecommunications services in regional Australia on a basis of being paid for by users. That's why there's a universal service obligation or a community service obligation, where essentially the revenues in the cities, a proportion of those is set aside to fund.
So you could do something similar
in rural Australia. You could potentially do something similar, but these are all questions of detail which need to be worked through before a government could decide to go further down that track, which is why the plan recommends that the next step would be a major study into this question of road pricing, to be carried out by Infrastructure Australia or by the Productivity Commission. In our response to the Harper review into competition policy last year, we also noted that when it comes to heavy vehicle charging, that's to say trucks using our roads, there's a commitment that by 27/18 we'll take a recommendation to COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, in relation to an independent pricing regulator for the pricing that might be charged to trucks. But that's quite separate from a broader question of whether you introduce road pricing across all vehicles. As I say,
but that will be further reviewed by either Infrastructure Australia or the Productivity Commission.
Well, that's what the plan recommends. The government will now consider that recommendation and we'll respond in due course.
Okay, just a quick one. I mean, you talk about telecommunications in the bush, putting your former portfolio hat on. Infrastructure Australia also talks about moving to the split and sale of the NBN, perhaps a lot sooner than had earlier been suggested. What do you think about that?
Well, I think they're simply picking up the policy direction that the Turnbull government has always supported, which is that in due course, when you've got the NBN up and running and the network is rolled out, you would look at returning it to private sector ownership. But I think that's still some period away.
All right. Minister for Major Projects, Paul Fletcher, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, David.